Hello everybody, this is Tip Top MTG here today with another Magic the Gathering video. In today's video, we are going to be taking a look at Adventures in the Forgotten Realms and a bunch of spoilers that have come out for it. So let's just jump right into this. And I say that, but actually really quickly, we're going to be looking at the rares, mythics, and legendaries, as well as any cards that I find interesting from the past couple days. I'm going to give you guys my opinions on them, where I think they'll be good, are they fun, what is kind of the intended purpose, all of that. So let's just jump right into this. Starting off, we have Long Rest. It's X green, green, green for a sorcery, and it says return X target cards with different mana values from your graveyard to your hand. If 8 or more cards were returned to your hand this way, your starting life total becomes equal to your starting life your life total becomes equal to your starting life total. Exile Long Rest. So this reminds me a lot of a card called Seasons Past. I believe it's a 6-cost card that just says return any number of cards with different converted mana costs from your graveyard to your hand. Now this lets you technically pay less mana for it to get a lesser effect. For instance, you can pay 1 green, green, green and return 1 card. And it's not with mana value X or less and different mana values. So it's not like if you pay 5 into X, you have to get a 1, a 2, a 3, a 4, and a 5. It could be a 10 drop and a 0 drop that you get for that. And then also if you manage to get 8 or more, which means you have 11 mana, you kind of get to reset your life total. So in Commander, that's going to probably be a bigger deal in terms of like the amount of life gain, but I should say it's a bigger amount, but I think in 2-player formats, it'll be a bigger deal. However, getting up to that is pretty high. I think that's, you're not really putting this in your deck for that reason. You're putting it in for the other effect. Now in something like Standard and Historic, I do think it is going to be the best option for mass graveyard kind of recursion, at least in mono green, and I think that that's pretty cool, but I think something like Seasons Past is still going to be a better card in those older formats, just because yes, you are paying 6 mana, but at this point, you know, for 6 mana with Long Rest, you are getting 3 cards. 6 mana with Season Pass, you get as many cards as you have mana values. And on top of that, so essentially what that means is that at its best, this is only better than Seasons Pass if you're paying 5 mana to get 2 cards. Is that good? No, not really. And it's also a little bit more green intensive. And so some people could argue it's basically just getting 1, in which case you might as well get regrowth. So I think that this is in such an awkward spot where it's not going to be better than Seasons Past in many ways. And therefore, in those older formats, isn't going to see that much play unless it's a redundant piece. For instance, you could have this and Season Pass in one deck. So not my favorite card, but also not my least. Next, we have Forsworn Paladin. It's a 1-cost black creature, human knight 1/1 with menace, and it lets you pay 1 in a black to tap and pay 1 life. Then you create a treasure token. So you're paying 2 mana to get 1, but you're also paying a life and tapping this creature. So that's a lot of cost. But recurring treasure creation on a 1-drop does seem pretty good, and you can do it at instant speed. So it could be that like you decide, oh, if I happen to, you know, I have this kill spell in my hand, if I don't need to use it, I'll just create a treasure. That can be a pretty nice backup. Then you can pay 3 mana, and target creature gets +2/+0 until end of turn. If mana from a treasure was spent to activate this ability, that creature also gains Death Touch. Honestly, this seems like a pretty good card. Not because necessarily any of its abilities are overly powerful, other than, you know, that bottom one does remind me of Knight of the Ebon Legion. I think I'm remembering this right. It was a 1-drop from a core set that just did a lot for 1 mana and was able to boost itself. This does that a little bit. And also gain Death Touch. This is not nearly as good as that card, but I do think that it has some potential that it is a 1-drop with a lot of text on it. A 1/1 Menacer for 1, not bad. Then the fact that it can create treasures if you need it, not bad. Then the fact that it can give things Death Touch or just boost them, not bad. And so all of these not bad abilities combined together seems like it could be pretty good value in that 1-drop slot. Next, we have this card, which can be translated into Hobgoblin Bandit Leader, although that's probably incorrect. It'll probably be slightly off, but either way, it's a 3-cost red creature, Goblin Rogue, 2/3, and it says other goblins you control get +1/+1, and then you can pay a red and tap it, and it deals damage equal to the amount of goblins that entered the battlefield under your control this turn to any target. Honestly, this card seems really, really good in Goblin decks. I think Historic is going to love this. I mean, you know, we play those 3-drop goblins that will boost up our other goblins +1/+1. Now, it does not give haste like a lot of 3-drop Goblin Lords. However, that ability to pay a red and tap, and, you know, if you play Muxus, have it enter the battlefield, then get 3 other creatures, you're paying 1 mana to do 4 damage, either to a player's face, to a creature. I think this is going to fit into those decks quite nicely. And if you combine this with something like Krenko, it is utter insanity. And the fact that it can hit players is, I think, why this is going to be so good. So I expect to see at least a 2 of in those Goblin decks. Next, we have Teleportation Circle. It's 3 and a white for an enchantment. At the beginning of your end step, flicker up to 1 target artifact or creature. So essentially, you exile and then return it. This is really, really good. It's kind of replacing Thassa in Standard. Thassa currently does this in Blue. However, I think that this is going to be a better card for the format. It's not indestructible. It can't become a creature and start attacking you. However, it can also exile artifacts. I don't believe Thassa could do that. Generally, in those older formats, I think this is also going to be really good. You know, we have a couple cards, Soul Herder, Thassa, there's a like artifact version of it as well. And I think just having more redundancy of this effect is going to be good. And, you know, there are going to be these cards that have those awesome ETB abilities. And I think this is going to really help you abuse those. So I think this could be part of a really interesting deck, but it's not something we haven't seen before. We have a 4-drop enchantment that flickers something at your end step. It's just, you know, this is technically worse than that, but it is also color shifted. So that's also something to think about. Next, we have Treasure Vault. It's an artifact land to tap and add colorless, and then you can pay XX, tap, and sacrifice it to create X treasure tokens. So, okay, I've seen a lot of people calling this pretty weak, and I can see the argument there. However, I do think the fact that this is an untapped artifact land may be enough just to push this to be played. I mean, I know looking at Tron decks, right? Okay, this counts as an artifact. You don't really care if you're not generating colored mana. And then if you need more artifacts, you can basically spend mana to create artifacts. Yes, those treasure tokens can then be spent on a later turn, and I'm sure there's something interesting you can do with that. But I think the fact that this has the ability to create multiple token artifacts means it's going to be pretty good. I think in those, you know, more multiplayer formats where board wiping artifacts is actually more common with things like Vandal Blast, this is often going to get caught in the crossfire. However, I think in those 1v1 formats, this could actually be a pretty good inclusion in a deck that doesn't care about not generating colored mana. Oh, also one last thing. It also is a way to take infinite colorless mana and make infinite colored mana and make your infinite colorless mana stick around. So that is another thing to think about when you're looking at this card. Next, we have the Book of Exalted Deeds. It's white, white, white for a legendary artifact. At the beginning of your end step, if you gained 3 or more life this turn, create a 3/3 white angel creature token with flying. Already, that's not that bad. We have an enchantment very similar to this in Standard right now. Then you can pay white, 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 tap, and exile this book, and you put an Enlighten counter on target angel. It gains, you can't lose the game, and your opponent can't win the game. Activate only as a sorcery. So this is actually a very powerful effect, and for 6 mana, that's not bad, especially saying you don't have to pay 6 mana all on one turn. You can actually do this in response to an opponent winning the game. So let's say they're about to hit you for lethal. In response, 3 mana, tap, exile it, now you can't lose the game. Now, I do want to say, this actually seemed... I lied. What am I saying? It literally says activate only as a sorcery. Scratch literally everything I just said. Can't do it at instant speed. However, this still seems really good to me, and if I'm reading it right, this works with a card currently in Standard known as Faceless Haven, which can turn into a creature and is every creature type when it does so. So then you could put an Enlighten counter on the Angel, and it gains. You can't lose the game and your opponents can't win. You can't lose the game and your opponents can't win. Yeah. And that seems really good because blowing up a land is a lot harder than blowing up a creature. And so I think that if that's a thing, I could actually see that being almost a gimmicky Standard deck where if you get these 2 cards out, you just kind of lock your opponents out from winning if they don't run land destruction, which means that more people are going to run land destruction, things like Field of Ruin and stuff like that. So I think that if it does work the way I'm thinking, this actually could be quite a powerful card. And even not, you can put that effect on a 3/3 white angel creature token as kind of a last-ditch effort, and I think that's kind of cool. Next, we have Mindflayer. It's a 5-cost blue creature horror, 3/3, and when it ETBs, you gain control of target creature for as long as you control Mindflayer. We have lots of effects like this, but it's cool to see another one. I don't know how dominant this will be in Standard, because Standard right now is very removal heavy, and so if this ever got too powerful, people would just start running more removal, but I think in those older formats, it's going to see a lot of the play, especially in something like Commander, and those gain control of opponent creature stuff, and I think that it could do some interesting things. We've seen these effects in the past, but not a lot recently, so it's kind of cool to see that. Next, we have Imireth, Desert Doom. It is a 5-cost blue legendary creature dragon, 5/5, so a 5/5 for 5 with flying. That is already really, really good for a blue card. Then it has Ward 4 as long as it's untapped. So it's very, very hard to hit this thing with removal while it's untapped. If you have a 3-cost, murder spell, it actually is a 7-cost murder spell as long as this is untapped. Then whenever it deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. Then if you have fewer than 3 cards in hand, draw equal to the difference. So essentially you're going to hit them, draw a card. Say you had no cards in hand when that happened. You then draw up to 3 cards. This card seems very, very powerful to me, especially as a blue creature. Blue is supposed to kind of be the worst at creatures, and a 5/5 for 5 with flying that when it's not attacking basically has pseudo hexproof and draws cards on hit. The only downside to this is that it's legendary. I don't think it's going to be that interesting as a commander, but I think that as a creature, this is going to be very, very value filled. And I think this probably should have been a 6-drop just to make it a little bit more fair. But it is a very powerful card in my opinion, just because it does kind of break the fact that blue normally doesn't get these very efficiently costed creatures. But then again, maybe this isn't efficiently costed anymore. I mean, if this was a green card and it cost 5 and was legendary, it'd probably enter as a 7/7. So maybe we're just kind of seeing power creep take blue up to kind of being normal, at least in the legendary slot. Next, we have Ol Gnawbone. It's a 7-cost 7/7, so I guess scratch what I just said. Legendary creature dragon with flying, and whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, create that many treasure tokens. So if this thing hits a player for 7, you're creating 7 treasure tokens. But it also applies to your other creatures. So if they deal 1 damage, you get a treasure. If they deal, 2, you get a treasure. If one of them is a 3/3 with trample and they block with a 1/1, you get 2 treasures. So that's a very, very powerful effect, and I see this one being more of a commander, viable commander, just because it is that kind of powerful effect that is very splashy. But in standard, it is a 7-drop. And it's a 7-drop for 7, or 7/7 for 7, which, it's fine. I think that maybe this is something people ramp into, but if you can get this to stay on the board, you're doing pretty well. However, the big issue I have with this card is it's a card that says if you're winning, win more. It's a 7/7 for 7 with flying, but if you can't attack your opponent, you're not going to be able to do anything with this card. And if you're already able to attack your opponent, maybe this is the only thing that can, you're probably winning the game. That's not always the case, but that's generally what happens. So I want you to keep that in mind when looking at this card. It's one of those cards that looks really good, but it says if you're winning, win more. Then we have these kind of new type of cards. So this is gonna not close out our video, but it is going to be a large part of it. It is classes. So essentially, it's almost like a saga, but instead of automatically rolling to the next level, you have to pay mana to roll to the next level. So you start with 0, and you get that as it enters the battlefield, and then you pay, for instance, 2 mana to go to level 2 on this one, and 3 mana to go to level 3, but it's not always that simple. And you keep the effects of the previous one. So it's not like you lose the previous effects, you get to keep all of them. So once you pay get up to level 3, you have all 3 of these effects on this one card, and you can only do this as a sorcery. So keep that in mind. Either way, let's read what this does. If you would roll 1 or more dice, instead roll that many dice plus 1 and ignore the lowest roll. So for 1 mana, that seems really good in a dice rolling deck. However, that seems like something that's going to be a little bit more gimmicky. But let's see. If you pay 2, whenever you roll 1 or more dice, target creature you control gets +2/+0 and gains menace until end of turn. And then if you pay 3, creatures you control have haste. So creatures you have control of haste, and whenever you roll a die, you're giving something menace +2/+2, and you get to kind of get the better roll. That's a lot of stuff for 1 mana, but when you look at how much mana you've actually put into it, with 6, it is not that insane. I mean, if you gave me a 6-drop enchantment that did that, I would say it's pretty good, but not the best thing in the world. But the fact that you can play this on 1, upgrade it on 2, then upgrade it on 3, I mean, you don't have any creatures, but it is something that I think is interesting. And you're going to notice all of the monocolored ones, except for the green ones, cost 1 mana. And there are also multicolored ones. So for instance, this one is a 2-drop in Gruul. Legendary creatures you control enter the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter on them. Not a bad effect. And then legendary creatures spells, you cast cost red and a green less to cast, but it only affects the colored mana. And then whenever you cast a legendary spell, exile the top 2 cards of your library, you may play them this turn, which by the way, they cost less, enter the battlefield with +1/+1 counters on them, and then kind of refresh themselves. So as long as you have the mana, you can kind of keep casting legendary spells. This is all, of course, assuming that you are using a legendary-only deck. And so I think that if you are in that style of deck, it actually says legendary creatures enter with +1/+1 counters, but the rest say legendary spells. So maybe this goes in one of those Planeswalker decks. It makes them cost less. You can then, whenever you cast a Planeswalker, cast another one. However, oftentimes legendary creatures are going to be a little bit more expensive, so maybe you can't cast more than one per turn, but then the cost helps you do that. I think this is really good if it's in the deck it's intended for, which is a legendary based deck, and if it's not that amazing, which is obvious because that's kind of what the card is built for. Then we have the Cleric class. It's a white enchantment class, and it says if you would gain life, you gain that much +1. Pretty good in those decks that just spam 1 life gain triggers. Then if you pay 4 mana, so you're going up pretty fast, whenever you gain life, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. So essentially you gain Heliod's ability. And then when this class becomes level 3, return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. You gain life equal to its toughness. So a lot of value here. The last one isn't a persistent effect. It instead is almost like a, if you need this, do it. You can pay 5 mana to resurrect something, which actually doesn't seem bad. However, just note, by the end of this, you have paid 10 mana for all these effects, which I don't know if I would play an enchantment that was a 10 drop that did that. But then again, you don't have to. That 5 cost ability at the end can be one of those, hey, this is sitting around and eventually you kill my creature, I'm going to bring it back. So I'm not sure. This seems pretty good. All of these seem pretty good, but I think these are cards where you're going to need to kind of see how they play and what play patterns they create before you can really judge them. Next, we have the Druid class. It's 1 and a green for a class, and whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you gain a life. Not very impressive. Then you have 3 mana. You may play an additional land on each of your turns. That's fine, but at this point you've already paid 5 mana. Not my favorite. Then you can pay 5 additional, so it's 10 total. When it becomes level 3, target land you control becomes a creature with haste, and this creature's power and toughness are equal to the number of lands you control. It's still a land. So definitely going in those landfall-based decks, it's another one of those. You may play an additional land, so that's always going to probably give it some attention, but I think this is really, really expensive for what it does, and it's not my favorite. But then again, maybe it's just that thing that you play, and over the course of the game it gets more powerful. Also note these are enchantments and can be destroyed by enchantment removal. Next we have Fighter class. It is a red and a white, and when it enters the battlefield, search your library for an equipment card, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle. So that's already really good. 2 mana, search your library for equipment, put it in your hand. Pretty good. Then if you pay 3 mana, equip abilities you cost 2 less to activate. So oftentimes a lot of those equip abilities are going to be either 1 or no mana. So that is again really good. And then level 3 for 5 mana, whenever a creature you control attacks, up to 1 target creature blocks this combat if able. So again, just really, really good. This is everything you're looking for in an equipment deck. This is almost an auto include in any equipment deck. Next we have Monk class. It's a 2-cost blue and white class, and it says the second spell you cast each turn costs 1 less to cast. So pretty good, but it's really generating you 1 mana value every turn, which is not bad, but you do need to be casting 2 spells, and that's not super sustainable. When this class becomes level 2, return up to 1 target non-land permanent to its owner's hand. Could be yours, which then lets you kind of cast a second spell, but then again, you just spent mana to upgrade it, meaning you're probably not casting a second spell. So I think that is kind of a self-inflicted problem with this card. At the beginning of your upkeep, this is level 3 for 3 mana, exile the top card of your library. For as long as it remains exiled, you may cast this card as long as you cast another spell this turn. So it's not just you can cast it until end of turn, it is just, you're basically getting a second hand every turn. So you're drawing 2 cards per turn, one of them goes to your second hand, and you can access your second hand only after you've cast something from your first, which is really, really interesting. I think that this card is a little contradictory in terms of it wanting you to cast lots of spells per turn, but also wants you to activate its abilities. However, if you do get to that third ability, that is a lot of value, and it's only actually 7 mana over the course of multiple turns. Next, we have Paladin class. It's a white class, and it says spells your opponents cast during your turn cost 1 more to cast. That's pretty good for a 1-drop. Honestly, this just makes people less likely to do things on your end step, meaning they're gaining slightly less value out of it. Then you can pay 3 mana, and creatures you control get +1/+1. I'd pay 4 mana for an enchantment that gave everything +1/+1 and made it harder for my opponents to cast spells. And then whenever you attack on level 3, if you pay 5 mana, target attacking creature gets +1/+1 for each other attacking creature and gains double strike. So one creature is getting huge and gaining double strike. This just seems really good in those stereotypical go wide white decks, and I think we'll just see play in those for that first and last ability. It's kind of this thing that you can do when you run out of things to play. It can still get you that value later on and not let you waste mana. Then we have the Ranger class. It's a 2 cost, and when it ETBs, you create a 2/2 wolf. So essentially, you're paying 2 mana for an enchantment that does nothing and a wolf. But that enchantment doesn't really do nothing. It says whenever you attack, put a +1/+1 counter on target attacking creature. That's if you pay 2 mana to make it level 2. And then you can pay 4 mana to make it level 3 and look at the top card of your library at any time, and you may cast creature spells from the top card of your library. This seems really, really good. I think those creature-based decks are going to run it. At its worst, it's a 2/2 for 2. And then eventually later on in the game, you can just pay more mana to make this better. So I think those green kind of creature-heavy decks, maybe green token decks especially, will like this. And I think this will just see a lot of play in a lot of different places. Next, we have the Rogue class. It's a 2 cost blue and black class, and it says whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, exile the top card of that player's library face down. You may look at it as long as it remains exiled. So at first, you're just exiling stuff. Then at level 2, it says creatures you control have menace, which means you're more likely to be able to exile stuff because it's harder to block. And then you can pay 4, and it says you may play cards exiled with Rogue class and spend mana as though we're mana of any color to cast those spells. So essentially, you're stealing cards from your opponent. Very rogues. It reminds me a lot of rogue decks. I think that if rogue decks continue and, become a big thing, this will definitely be in those style of decks. And I think this, just everything about it feels synergistic, where some of the other ones feel like 3 random effects. This one feels like it really synergizes incredibly well together. Each ability helps another. Next, we have Sorcerer class. 2 cost, blue and red, and when it ETBs, draw 2 cards, discard 2 cards. So you essentially Faithless Looting, which is not bad, but it is 2 mana. And then it says, if you upgrade it to level 2, creatures you control have tap, add blue or red, spend this mana only to cast an instant or sorcery spell, or to gain a class level. Pretty good. I mean, if you pay 2 mana and then tap 2 of your creatures to cast an instant or sorcery, this is almost a free upgrade. The upgrade cost tapping 2 creatures, which does not seem bad to me. And you can do that at instant speed, so it's not like you're kind of losing out on value. You can do it at your opponent's end step. And then it says, whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, that spell deals damage to each opponent equal to the number of instant and sorcery spells you cast this turn. So the first one will deal 1, second one will deal 2, and you're going to be able to cast a lot of instants and sorceries because you're tapping your creatures for mana. So I can see a deck where this is almost the center point, where you have a bunch of spells that create creatures when they ATP, maybe give them haste, and then you do some interesting things where you're dealing lots of damage. I think it's cool. I just don't think it's the most powerful. Next, we have the Warlock class. It's a black enchantment class. At the beginning of your end step, if a creature died this turn, each opponent loses 1 life. Not super amazing, but it is each opponent, so in those multiplayer formats, it is going to do better than something that's at target. It's also a 1-drop, so that's, fine. You can pay 2, and when this class becomes level 2, look at the top 3 cards of your library, put 1 of them into your hand and the rest into your graveyard. 2 mana to draw a card selectively. Not bad. Blue can do it a little more effectively, but it is putting things in the graveyard, which is instantly just better. Then you can pay 7. At the beginning of your end step, each opponent loses life equal to the life they lost this turn. Very, very powerful effect, but you are paying 10 mana for it. It seems like 10 mana to max your class seems to be a very common thing. Yeah, this seems really, really good. Just note, this does not use counters, so you can't proliferate it up to that level. Just keep that in mind. Next, we have Wizard class. It's a blue enchantment class, and it says you have no max hand size. So Sorcerer's Spellbook, or Spellbook is just what it's called. It's a 0-drop artifact that has that text. Then when it becomes level 2 for 3 mana, you draw 2 cards. And then when it becomes level 3 for 5 mana, it says whenever you draw a card, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. So if you're wanting to draw cards, do this. I mean, it's a 1-drop thing that says you have no hand size, and then it's divination, and then it's just a pretty powerful effect. All right, let's move away from the classes. Those were, by the way, all of them. This one is Zorn. It's a 3-cost, not green, red creature elemental, 3/2. And if you would create 1 or more treasure tokens, instead create that, those treasure tokens plus an additional 1. Pretty good in those treasure-based decks. If you're running treasures, you run this. If you're not running this. Dancing Sword, 2-cost white artifact equipment. Equipped creature gets +2/+1, and when equipped creature dies, you may have Dancing Sword become a 2/1 with flying and ward 1. If you do, it isn't an equipment anymore. Pretty powerful effect, just because in equipment decks you often have the issue of either have all creatures or all equipment. And yes, you do need to have that creature to begin with, but if your opponents kill your creature that was holding all your equipment, you can have Dancing Sword become that creature, not become that creature, but become a creature, and then you're able to re-equip stuff. So I think it actually solves a pretty big problem in those equipment-based decks, and therefore I think it's pretty good. Alright guys, that is it for this video. I know it's been a long one, not as long as the last one, just because I was a little more selective with which cards I chose. Expect some more videos coming up in either today or tomorrow. I've been trying to catch up with everything that's been happening. Leave a comment down below with what you guys think about Adventures in the Forgotten Realms so far. I'm planning on doing my usual kind of videos, you know, top 10 most expensive, review, MTG Arena stuff, but I'm also planning on doing some new stuff, and I want to know your guys' opinion on it when it comes out, so stay tuned for that. To stay tuned for that, hit that subscribe button and hit the notification bell. I will see you guys in the next one. Bye.